So we'll be moving into discussion of affordable housing demonstration program. Community Development Director Susan McLean, Housing Development Consortium Executive Director Marty Koistra. All right, floor is yours. Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor, City Council, members of the public. My name is Susan McLean, and I am your Director of Community Development. And I'm joined by Mr. Marty Koistra, the Executive Director of the Housing Development Consortium of King County. You asked for discussion on the topic of the Affordable Housing Demonstration Program. Tonight, I will provide a brief introduction to the program and some highlights of what we have learned. Please note that we plan to provide a more exhaustive information in 2022. Mr. Koistra will provide a bit more information about what cities can do to foster affordable housing development. In particular, he will provide some information about what it takes for affordable housing providers to put together projects. And this information is intended to inform your discussion today. Next slide, please. Pardon me. So just briefly for members of the public who are not here, you enacted Ordinance 718 in 2019. That's the Affordable Housing Demonstration Program. The intent was that the program would be in existence for 3 years. It would consist of accepting up to 5 projects into the program by City Council approval. All projects would be affordable to up to 50% area median income for King County, with one specifically identified as being affordable up to 30% AMI. And the idea was to provide some flexibility in development and regulations in exchange for housing affordability. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of information about who has expressed interest so far, and this was included in your staff memo as well. 2 different cottage type housing, one that would be a very small scale, single townhouses, single family homes, one idea for studio apartments or kind of micro housing in the downtown area, but who actually came forward with proposals were Habitat for Humanity, which was accepted into the program with 40 affordable owner-occupied townhouse units, and then DESC, which is in the permitting process at this time. I should also note that staff is negotiating an interlocal agreement for your consideration in December. If all goes according to plan, both projects would be through the permitting process in early 2022. Next slide, please. So what we've heard is from all seven folks who've expressed interest is that both 50 and 30% AMI require subsidy. 30% AMI projects that are serving that level of affordability, those projects are most competitive if they are serving people who have experienced homelessness, people with disabilities, veterans, and seniors, primarily because the most competitive source of funding is the Housing Finance Commission's 9% housing tax credit program, which Mr. Koistra will talk about later. For small scale and inexperienced developers, it's very difficult for those people to seek funding. They tend to be less competitive at a small scale. Also, for some, it was difficult just to put together a project with the financing, the technical aspects of development, along with figuring out how to secure that affordability over 50 years. Also, what we've heard is that the program in general requires an upfront investment. That is the council process, which is public, while putting together the overall project. Just a complicated development is complicated. Next slide, please. On process feedback we've heard so far is some feedback about the upfront council process, in some cases creating risk and some expense in advance of having the entitlements that come with the permit. But the overall process is both for the Affordable Housing Demonstration Program and permitting is relatively straightforward. There was some comment that some clarity on what the city exactly requires regarding public engagement would be helpful. And then the city is developing and is still in the process of developing some experience and some capacity to negotiate and monitor around affordability. Next slide, please. So here's some suggested ways that these people have suggested that the city can support affordability. A couple would like the pilot project to be extended beyond 2022. There were some process considerations. Can you provide translation? There were some definite suggestions for permanent code changes, reducing the costs of permitting was a suggestion, or helping to expedite permits, having sort of a champion who would help the project all along the way. Suggesting to implement an affordable housing fund by the city, upfront SEPA, which we will talk about next year as part of our comprehensive plan EIS, offering city-owned land, and then streamlining the subdivision process, which has been on our work program in sort of that hopeful category for quite some time. Next slide, please. So here with us as well is Mr. Marty Koistra, the Executive Director of the Housing Development Consortium of King County, to provide some additional information to hopefully help inform your discussion about this program and about affordable housing in general. Thank you, Marty, for being here.
Thank you, Director McLean, and good evening, council members. Next slide, please. What is affordable housing? I think you all know this. I mean, it's a relative term in many respects when we talk about it, but generally speaking, in this area, we're discussing households that are below 80% of area median income, or low income households tend to be the group that the advocate community thinks of as affordable housing. What makes it affordable, though, is this question of how much of a person's income goes to their housing costs. And that's a number we like to see at 30% or less. It can include a wide range of housing types, all the way from emergency shelter to permanent supportive housing to some kind of special needs or targeted populations like veterans and seniors. Those that are working at lower minimum wages, or then this term we have coined maybe a decade or so ago, called workforce, which is intended to be a little less threatening than affordable housing. We like to talk about workforce housing. It's kind of a misnomer because you can have people working all the way down to below 30% area median income in this market who are in need of housing. And then, of course, different types of ownership. And very seldom do we see single family detached product being built anymore here because of the density concerns. And so a lot of townhomes, condos have been tough in Washington State, which has had the worst condo liability laws for many years. We made some improvements to that 3 years ago, but there's still more work to do. And again, when we talk about AMI, area median income, it's ELI, extremely low, VLI, very low, low, and moderate, and the various percentages of income there. Next slide, please. So just a screenshot here, and I haven't been able to get this updated since 2018, but just to try to give you a sense, when you look at the kind of pea green, at least on my screen, those are the below 30% area median income developments. In King County. The blue are the 30 to 60, and then the orange gets into the 60 to 80. You'll see the high concentration of below 30 AMI in downtown Seattle. A lot of that is driven by the reality that Seattle is one of the first and very few markets in the country that has taxed itself for affordable housing and has a housing levy, which makes it very competitive for the 9% tax credit program that the director mentioned earlier. But you do see the efforts to try and spread the affordable product around the county. Next slide, please. So what are some of the key ingredients that make development work? Well, let's look at first, what do cities need to have on the next slide? I usually talk about four key things. One is cities need to have the ability to work on shaping policies and programs, and these get very technical. So where they can get support either on staff or through outside consultants to help shape the policies and programs that make sense for the contextual needs of that market. Available land with favorable zoning, two things that have to go together. The land has to be buildable and it has to be zoned in such a way that it can be effectively utilized for affordable product. Some sort of gap financing if you want to be competitive. We'll talk more about what that means in a few minutes. And then the last is the ability to garner support from the neighborhood to site affordable housing, which is becoming harder and harder all of the decades that I've been doing this work. Next slide, please. So what do developers need from a jurisdiction in order to make it work? Well, there has to be, as we mentioned earlier, some kind of local investment. That can come in the form of land, come in form of waiving of impact fees, all of those things. And we'll show you an example of why, if we don't have any resources, it makes it that much harder. Land, again, with the favorable zoning. A welcome mat, instilling confidence in siting without consequential resistance. Most of the nonprofit organizations are fighting 4 and 5 year gestation periods on projects. They're under-resourced, understaffed, and dealing with massive and significant compliance issues, the things that nobody would actually wish upon themselves unless they were committed to this mission. And so if they don't sense that there's a welcoming environment in a community, that's a no-no. And finally, staff support to make sure that permitting and design can be done in an expedited way. Commitment across departments to avoid impeding and slowing down development, and ready availability of knowledgeable guidance, problem solving, and liaisoning. Just to give you a recent example, Inland Development, which does 4% tax credit deals, took off on a 500 unit multifamily affordable project in Auburn. When they initially sat down with the staff there, it was going to be a 2+ year effort to get that project permitted, and everybody, including the council members, sat down and made an agreement to get it done in 6 months, which they did. It's that kind of enthusiasm and passion that tends to attract more development. We're seeing this now in Tacoma, where rents for a long time were not necessarily justifying the ability to carry the cost of development and owning. That has changed because of the driving and increased rents, and Tacoma has a much better permitting timeline than Seattle does. So we're starting to see a lot of development happening there. Next slide, please. Again, just a quick reminder, when I look at those AMIs across the bottom there, if I'm in that below 30% AMI bracket, I need significant levels of public subsidy, including housing choice vouchers to take care of the operations and rent of those buildings. And 30 to 50, I also need some levels of subsidy. In the 50 to 80, a lot of times we're still going to need subsidy or a multifamily tax exemption program or something. And if we want to still do 80 to 125, we've got to do something hopefully in the zoning range. All this to say that the deeper you want to go, the more subsidy that's essential. Next slide, please. Who provides it? Well, we have public housing authorities applicable for you all. That would be the King County Housing Authority, nonprofits and social service organizations, public agencies, and then private market developers. Next slide, please. How is it funded? On the capital side, we get local, state, and federal resources for construction and development, and then operating dollars for the deeper subsidized programs for operations, maintenance, and services. Local and city and county tend to use CDBG or home dollars, property tax levies we mentioned before. Currently working with 4 jurisdictions on the east side to consider doing property tax levies for housing there. Sales and employee taxes, we all know about the fact that this is the most regressive state in the entire nation, so you are reliant on the most regressive tools such as sales taxes. King County has a transit-oriented development fund we put into place 4 years ago through the King County bonding of stadium taxes. Regional consortia, ARCH, and then now SKIP, South King County Housing and Homelessness Partners, is soon to launch its own capital fund, general funds, and philanthropy. Next slide, please. So applications are required at the city, the county, the state, and the Housing Finance Agency. Just to mention a few, sometimes projects will have 7 or 8 different funding sources. We have developed a decade or more ago a common application, but there's still differing pieces to this. So the application process is extremely extensive and expensive. It can cost upwards of $50,000 to $100,000 to process these applications alone. Will you get an award? This is always the question in this highly competitive, under-resourced market. We got to get the local capital subsidy, and then we go for the state one, and then we go for the operations, and then finally we go to the Finance Commission for the federal tax credits. Not that long ago, 4% tax credits weren't competitive. The last few rounds, they've been able to allocate maybe $250 million and had $1 billion in requests. Current system is headed in the direction of also being targeted. So instead of projects being chosen by strategy or readiness, things like that, we're looking at certain populations like veterans or seniors or others being focused, which makes it that much more difficult and less predictable to say when and whether or not I will get funded for my project. Next slide, please. The trust fund is critical. It comes from the state. Every dollar that we put in through the trust fund, we get about $6 leveraged out of that. Those homes are required to be affordable for at least 40 years. A decade or more ago, we were at $200 million in the trust fund. We've had some really sluggish years. Now we're finally getting back to where we were 10 years ago in terms of around $200 million available. Next slide, please. The most prolific and used funding program is actually run by the Internal Revenue Service, not through HUD or any other group like that. Highly confusing for most people. It's a low-income housing tax credit. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to get deep into the tax credits because this could take hours, but a tax credit funded project has a 10-year credit period, 15-year recapture period, and 15 plus years to exit out for the investors to get out of the program. They purchase the tax credits by providing equity. There's a 9% program, which is highly competitive. That's the program that the commission and our funders here like to use for permanent supportive housing. At most in a given year, we might be able to do 5 projects in King County. 3 of those are likely to go to Seattle because they have a levy that they can match against it. The 4% program is not necessarily competitive, although you need to tie it to bonds, and there is a cap on bonds, which we certainly hope if the Build Back Better Act finally gets passed in the Senate, we should be able to get enough resources into that program to build about another 812,000 units in the country. Highly needed, and hopefully people will wake up and get that taken care of. CRA investors, Community Reinvestment Act investors from banks and others, insurance companies, tend to buy up these credits, and they're done through either syndicators or direct investors. Next slide, please. How does it pencil? Well, just to give you a quick comparison on the development side, if I'm doing conventional real estate development, my total project cost is usually equal to my debt and the equity that I put into it. The debt gets paid down by rental income, and the equity is recaptured through cash flow, appreciation, and sale. A lot of developers sell those buildings within 1 to 7 years. On the other hand, if I'm doing affordable development, The rents mean that there's little or no resources available, so no debt. The nonprofits who do this development have no owner equity or resale of assets because they're holding on to these buildings for 50 to 100 years. So it's a much different context in that regard. That's why we also build extremely durable buildings that can last that long without as much recapitalization cost. Next slide, please. Just to give you a quick sense, I had two of our members at HDC do some work for you all to take a look at the particular parking lot next to the garage at the transit center. And we looked at a 4-story scenario of 92 units or a 5-story scenario of 123 units. And you can see when we get down there to line 5, there was a gap of either 2.6 or $3.8 million. Should we have been able to come up with those kind of resources from some other public source, though that particular site would be viable. The other dilemma is that the site, it falls about 3 blocks, according to my analysis, outside of what's known as a qualified census tract. So the project would not be available for this thing called a basis boost, which means that that gap would prevent that project from actually getting built. If you look on the next slide, I believe we have a map of where the qualified census tracts are, and you can see there's an area of Burien there that is just not part of that schema. So this makes it even more difficult and competitive. Next slide, please. So the ingredients, once again, got to have resources, got to have land, got to have zoning, got to have policies that actually work, and hopefully some way of creating additional subsidy through fee reductions, waivers, impact fees, whatever it is, handing out that welcome mat. And now we have a new program called Opportunity Zones, which are still being highly controversial. They're kind of like a different version of low-income housing tax credits, which allow investors to get by without paying capital gains tax if they make an investment in affordable housing. And there's a few of those being tested in the area here and highly controversial in other parts of the country about whether they're another abuse of our system. Next slide, please. That's all I have. I'm sorry that I whipped through that so quickly. It's very complicated stuff, but if there are any questions that we can answer, we're here.
Thank you very much. Council, is there any questions for Marty or Susan? Go ahead, Councilor Tasta.
Susan and Marty, thank you. I know I'm the one who has pushed for us to talk about our affordable housing demonstration program because it's something near and dear to my heart, and I've been working on the Affordable Housing Committee, and I've been proud that we've had a program and have wondered what we can do to make it work better. And I appreciate, Susan, you reaching out to those folks who have expressed an interest. I know I've had a conversation with Ryan Donahue at the Habitat for Humanity. He serves on the Affordable Housing Committee with me. He has said that they have found the city easy to work with and they appreciate the support that you've provided them. So I was glad to hear that. One conversation that he and I had was about the desire to try to create, and this is what Habitat does, and Marty, I know you know this, obviously, is to support owner-occupied housing, because that has such a different impact in the ability of people to begin to create wealth and build themselves a better life. So I guess I'm what I try to figure out about our program, seeing all the constraints that you've laid out, Marty, which, someone would look at that and say, how in the world do we build affordable housing? It's why we haven't been building affordable housing. To figure out what we could be doing differently. I mean, what and I always come back to the sort of maybe smaller is better. And we try to figure out with all the single family lots we have in Burien, more ADUs and the cottages and the approaches, the infill that isn't 500 unit apartment buildings, but is distributed throughout the community. And to me, that was what, in some ways, our program was intended to try to experiment with. The range from hundreds of units in one place to distributing units in lots of places. And what does it take to do that? I realize the complexity of it. And I appreciate that there's been interest in multiple kinds of development. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on what we could do differently as a city to try to, besides changing our zoning in some cases, which I know is on our list to do at some point in time. But is there anything else that we could be doing to try to incentivize or catalyze work that others might want to be, building in our community? Either you or Marty. I don't, That's an open-ended question.
Marty will have a lot more details on how all the financing works, but I know that in one of our interviews with one of the people who was interested, they explicitly said for owner-occupied housing, they were looking at an AMI of around 60%. And so that's typically what they work with for owner occupancy. And Marty will be able to, I'm sure, describe the whys of that.
Sure.
And maybe that's, something to think about in our program. I mean, if we did, and we set it at 50%, but if we made an adjustment to that to say it's 80%, would we see more development coming in? Now, we might not get the 30%. Well, we know we've got one in the works for 30%, but would we see more interest in being able to do some creative things? Yeah.
I mean, if I was thinking about program design, most often around here, we're more likely to be in the 60 to 80% AMI range on the owner-occupied stuff. Rental, 60% and below. Even 50 is doable with tax credits. But if you want to hit that upper market, the only way I was able to do it here before I worked for HDC was with that highly subsidized 0% Habitat for Humanity loan, which is like the buildings behind me there at High Point. Those are Habitat for Humanity homes. The challenge you have in this market also, though, with doing that is you're going to likely be in a multifamily type structure. It's either going to be a townhome or something like that in an HOA. And in the case behind me there, the principal payment is less than the insurance and the HOA dues, right? And so those are the kinds of things that work against the affordability in the ownership realm. But if you can get into the 60 to 80 bracket, we are starting to work hard on developing some special pre-development funding and construction financing methods that we've launched through our Black Homeownership Initiative. And I think we will see a whole lot more energy around the production of affordable ownership product. But we've also got to accept the fact that when we're near transit and we're trying to do ownership, they're going to be denser buildings. They're going to be condos in multifamily structures, and you're not going to necessarily see this single family detached anymore. And Councilmember Tosta, that's the other hard thing that we're having this conversation around all over the country is exclusionary zoning is working against our ability to do the ownership the way we need to. And how do we allow not just ADUs, but starting to get duplexes, triplexes, and so on into traditional single-family neighborhoods?
Yeah, I'm a strong advocate for trying to figure out how we push the condo laws more aggressively, because that condos and townhouses and triplexes, duplexes, those are forms of housing that exist in many other areas of the country and have, been really helpful in serving moderate or low income families. And we don't do enough of that here in Washington.
No, the missing middle is a big part of our dilemma, right? The other thing I will just say is that with SCIP at its place where it is at, thank you to City Manager Brian and all of his peers, it will soon have its own capital fund, and jurisdictions like yours have agreed to pool your House Bill 1406 tax dollars. If you keep your welcome mat out and you keep your program active, and I'm stepping into giving you advice here, you can take it or leave it, but you could be one of the first jurisdictions in South King County to tap that capital fund for gap financing to do projects. If you stay proactive, you are one of the only jurisdictions that has in South King County this demonstration program, right?
Right. Well, and that's what I was saying. I'm proud that we have put this in place and just want to optimize our ability to use it. So that's why I keep pushing you, Susan, to talk to us about it and make it better. Thank you. Thank you for the
Council, is there any other questions? Comments? Go ahead, Councilmember Erica.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was also wondering about the missing middle because we are at up to 50%. But one of my questions is that, we're going through budget exercises, and you mentioned we have a regressive tax system and we're largely dependent on sales property and then a small amount to fees. So what do cities take into consideration based on the fact that our tax base is heavily relied on property tax, yet we're trying to develop more affordable property that unfortunately doesn't generate that tax base? Does it make cities sort of limit their offerings? I mean, what have you seen out there, and how do cities take that into consideration?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it is, again, the dilemma of the position you all are in, because you are facing the perfect storm of contradictions. The cap on your ability to raise taxes every year, the burden on the budget, the rating of the Public Works Trust Fund at the state for many, many years. All of these pieces combined make it really difficult, especially for South King County jurisdictions where you may not have as many higher paying, tax paying properties. And this is why you will hear some of the electeds in South King County saying, we don't need any more affordable housing here. We need luxury housing so we can get a tax base. The whole system is working against you. I don't need to tell you that. And this is why, we need to have a united campaign in front from all jurisdictions and all advocate levels to change that once and for all, because it just further hampers your ability to do this work. And on the east side and northeast side, we've had Arch for 26 years now. They've been able to take general fund money from their cities, pool it, and do a project every year. You're not going to see those same resources. That's 20 of the wealthiest zip codes in the county over there. Things don't work in the same way when you're in other parts of the county. So these are the challenges that we face. And because you have Arch, because you have the Seattle levy, those jurisdictions then put that local money on the table first. And when all the funders get together and their joint funders experiences, they look and they say, well, we got gap money here. It's the same thing when the people in Pierce County ask me, why don't we get as much trust fund money from the state used in our county? Why aren't we using as much tax credit money? Because you don't have the local match. That's the way the system's rigged, if you want to use that term, right? So if we're going to focus on equity, we've got to really change the system at the top, and it's going to take a lot of work. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you.
Thank you, Marty. Council, is there any other questions? Hearing no other questions. Oh, go ahead, Councilwoman Tostin.
I would, and perhaps this is something we talk about at a future meeting, and maybe it happens next year, but I definitely think we should examine this to figure out if there's a way we need to tweak it and extend it for a few more years. So I'll just put that out there as something I think we need to put in place. As Marty explained, it takes years in some cases to try to put these things together, and expiring in 3 years, and particularly probably in the middle of, with a pandemic in the middle of that, didn't help. So I'll just put that out there as a marker. I'd like to see things extended and tweaked a bit in thinking about that missing middle as well.
Any other questions from council members? Comments? Hearing none, now go ahead, City Manager.
I wanted to just make reference to the tremendous work that Marty Koester has done for the Housing Development Consortium for so many years. He is just a tremendous resource. He's always been available for us, for council, and, you know, as presentation as tonight. But the impact that he's had on housing in King County is pretty phenomenal. And he is also a Burien resident. So I wanted to make reference to Marty and the work that he's done here in King County.
Again, thank you very much, Marty.
Well,
And
thank you all for your service. You're doing the hard work, folks. Keep it up.